purpose of this video lesson is to help you become more familiar with the periodic table and some of the terminology associated with it. If you've printed a copy of the handout that goes with this, you're going to be coloring directly on there. If you weren't able to print a copy of that, grab a piece of paper and just draw a rough sketch of the periodic table so that you have something to write on and someplace to add some coloring. We really don't want you to color on the green periodic table that we handed out in class because we already have the diatomic elements marked on there, and we're going to want to add some other things to that later. The first thing I want you to be familiar with is some of the names for the families in the periodic table. These are written very tiny at the bottom of the columns on your green periodic table, but I wanted to draw your attention to them. The first column elements are called the alkali metals, the second column the alkaline earth metals, and over on the other side we have the halogens and the noble gases. We will on many occasions refer to these elements based upon their family name, so it's important that you become familiar with these. The other thing we're going to talk about today are the different types of elements, the main groups, the nonmetals, the transition metals, and the metalloids. At the bottom of the note sheet for this particular video lesson, we've defined some of these things. The representative elements, or main group elements, are the elements in the 8 tall columns on the periodic table. Metals are elements that look shiny, and they're malleable, meaning you can hammer them into a sheet. Ductile, you can draw them into a wire. They conduct heat and electricity. These elements tend to form positive ions. I've got a picture of some metals here, and you can see they have exactly the properties you would expect them to have. By contrast, the nonmetals are elements that look dull, don't conduct heat or electricity. In their solid form, they tend to be brittle, and a lot of them are actually gases at room temperature, things like nitrogen and oxygen. I've included a picture here of some of the nonmetals that are solids or liquids at room temperature. In between properties of nonmetals and metals, we have the metalloids or the semimetals. These elements are important because they are used to make semiconductors. Semiconductors are used in the manufacture of digital electronic devices like cell phones and Chromebooks and all these things that make digital learning possible. Next, we're going to color the periodic table. So on your note sheet, you can do some coloring or, like I said, just sketch a picture on a white piece of paper. I want you to pick 5 colors. I picked yellow, green, blue, orange, and purple, and make yourself a key. Remember that at any point, if this is going too fast and you need a little more time to color, all you have to do is pause the video. The first elements we're going to color are the main group metals. The main group metals are all the elements in the first column other than hydrogen, since hydrogen isn't a metal, all the elements in the second column, as well as aluminum. The next group we're going to color are the metalloids because they mark the boundary between the metals and the nonmetals. The metalloids are along the dark staircase of your periodic table, and it's the elements that touch that dark staircase with the exception of aluminum, but aluminum is an easy exception to remember because you're familiar with aluminum foil, which very definitely has metallic properties. Once you have the metals in place, the nonmetals become very easy to color because they're basically everything kind of over and to the right of the metalloids. By comparison to the number of metals on the periodic table, there are relatively few nonmetals. The next group, and the nonmetals also include hydrogen. The next group we're going to color are the transition metals. The transition metals is this big area in the middle of the periodic table. These contain a lot of the metals that you're familiar with in day-to-day life. You can see here we have things like iron and copper and zinc and silver and gold and lead. A lot of the things that you're familiar with as being metals are metals specifically of the type transition metals. Notice that the transition metals do kind of form a triangle that extends over and underneath the metalloids. The last group we need to color are the inner transition metals. They're called the inner transition metals because they actually belong in the periodic table right where this dark line is. They're removed from the periodic table to make the periodic table have a convenient shape and to make it fit nicely onto a piece of paper. But if the periodic table were drawn the way it really would need to be drawn, you would have to slice the periodic table right here, push the two pieces apart, and insert the inner transition metals back where they belong. A number of the inner transition metals are elements that are man-made or tend to be somewhat radioactive. As I had mentioned earlier, there are a lot more metals than there are nonmetals. The nonmetals are just the green elements shown here, whereas the metals include the main group metals in yellow, remembering aluminum over here, the transition metals in purple, and the inner transition metals in blue.